Okay, welcome again, everyone. Now we have to start. I think several people have joined and many are joining on the way. So once again, this is the 16th edition of the African Science Frontiers Initiatives Science Seminar Series 2021. And from the beginning of January, we have maintained this and we are grateful for your support so far. Our theme for this year has been disrupting stagnation, empowering Africa's future. So today we'll be looking at the role of government in science and scientific research in Africa. We'll have as our speaker, eminent professor, Professor Alinah Segobye. I will introduce her the appropriate time. The African Science Frontiers Initiatives, abbreviated as SFI, as we call it, as many of you who have been joining this platform have recognized, is a platform for science capacity building in Africa, and we engage in training, career development. We train in several courses that relates to scientific research processes. We have trainings in science leadership and science communication, and we have mentoring programs, and we have science seminars series and workshops as the one we have this evening. Our overarching goal is to contribute to Africa's path to development through science and scientific research. Our vision is to raise the next generation of African scientists who have the competencies and the right competencies to drive Africa's developmental and transformational agenda through innovative scientific research. We have several missions. One and most important is to instill excellence in science in Africa through competence acquisition, capacity building, and career development. We create seminars that will bring to the fore discussions on how the scientific community in our continent can proactively, intentionally, and consciously contribute to Africa's development. We believe that the scientific community in Africa and in every nation has a cardinal role to play in pushing forward needed development across every sector in the society. And until the African community in Africa rises to this call, our development will continue to evade us. So, in order to enhance this process, we have this platform in which we hope we support the skill acquisition, science capacity building of Africa's development. So our seminars are there, hands-on courses we organize. Many of you have been attending these courses, and so far in the last one, just over 1 year, we started this platform. We have trained more than 400 African professionals, scientists, from those who are pursuing their PhD to senior faculty members at different universities, and this has cut across more than 30 African countries so far. And in regards to that, we have another course that is coming up next week, 13th to 17th of December, and that is on scientific writing and publishing. We continue to have very high expectation in the sense of the number of people who apply to these trainings, which really indicates the importance you assign to this capacity building and hands-on trainings. That course, the application has closed, and by tomorrow latest, Those who have been accepted will be informed. We received over 670 applications across Africa, those who want to participate in this full week hands-on training in academic scientific writing and publishing. We promise to take maximum of 100 people from the 600. So we do our best to ensure very clear consensus selection of people. We consider the genders, we consider career development, we consider age, we consider the needs, we consider your motivation for taking. So we take into account several factors to ensure that those who are offered this position are in the position to use the skills they are going to learn. And one thing we do is that since we started every training we have had, we establish a mentoring program at the end of that training, in which those who have attended the course can enroll in this mentoring program and further develop their skills, the skills they have learned from the course in a hands-on collaborative approach. In addition to what we do, we also do research. We currently have in the pipeline surveys on Africa, research fund in Africa, and as well as university industry partnership in Africa. And the goal here is to be able to get information and the state of the art around this topic so that our discussions like we have this evening will be evidence-based on what is happening in the continent. And when you come to these trainings, we don't just give you skills. If you go to our YouTube channel, my colleague Eman is there in the background. She will put those links there for you to see. If you go to our YouTube channel, you see the testimonials. Those who have attended these courses give about their experiences. So we allow you to get the training, to get the skills, at the same time to make new connections. We ensure there is collaboration between brothers and sisters across Africa. We mentor you. We ensure that what you learn, you can immediately put them into practice. And above all, we challenge you. We challenge you to think about what you do in a way of challenging yourself, asking the question, how is this contributing to the development of our continent? Yeah, so for this year, we have one more topic to go, and that will be on the 19th of December, where we'll be looking at the role of the NGOs and charities in advancing scientific research in Africa. And that will be the last session we have for this year, which has been fantastic, the achievements we have made. This seminar series will continue next year as well. But next year, we are going to change direction. This year, we have focused on aspect of career development and capacity building, bringing discussions that challenge us on how we, across different sectors, like today we are talking about the role of the government, how all these sectors are contributing to advancing research and science in Africa in the perspective of contributing to Africa's development. Next year, what we want to do is to ask the question, who is doing what in Africa, in African science, and how are the activities going on contributing to Africa's development? So we're going to spotlight cutting edge research across all fields of endeavor, and bring them to the fore and show how people are pursuing these scientific activities in a way that is contributing to Africa's development. So no field will be left behind. We are going to include all fields and ensure that people who are invited will be able to showcase their contribution in their scientific research for Africa's development. All right, so I will quickly introduce the speaker for today. This is Professor Alinah K. Segobye. Currently, she's a Botswanan, and currently she's an extraordinary professor at the Northwest University, and she's a research scholar at the African Futures Institute in South Africa. She's the former dean of the Faculty of Human Sciences at the University of Namibia University of Science and Technology. She's a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. She served as the African Union Commission's Champions for Arts and Culture and Heritage panel of experts. Prof. Segobye has teaching and research and consultancy experience in African studies, including archaeology, culture, and heritage management, as well as HIV/AIDS, gender, and development. Prof. Segobye has authored several articles, essays, and book chapters across different aspects of Africa's development. In terms of her education, Prof. Segobye is an alumnus of the University of Cambridge, where she did her master's in philosophy, as well as her PhD. She has received various national and international awards and recognition for her contribution to science, to community building, to raising capacity of the academia and outside the academia. She's a member of various boards and international communities, both within the academia and as well as outside the academia. She's also a member of several editorial boards of international journals. She also has membership of various professional associations. So this evening is a privilege to have Professor Alinah Segobye to guide us through this topic we have given her today, the role of government in scientific research in Africa. Prof. Segobye, the floor is yours, and please speak to us.
Thank you very much, Bright, and good evening or good day, colleagues. Thank you for the generous introduction. Let me start by thanking the colleagues who put together a series of seminars for, among other things, recognizing the diversity and I'd say her wealth of talent in the area of scientific research on the continent. I'd like especially to single out Dr. Bright Nwaru and Dr. Emma Nsobo for this work that they are doing as the African Science Frontiers Initiative. I would like to acknowledge, among other things, some of my colleagues who I see in the meeting room, who have been also instrumental in my own journey of growth as an academic. I see some from Botswana, some from Namibia, and across the world. My presentation today is going to focus not only on the subject of government funding science, but across board on the issue of how Africa can begin to imagine and revalue science on the continent. And I'll just share my screen so that I can share my presentation. Right. Let me know if you can see the screen already, the presentation.
Yeah, we see it, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to add to my introduction from Bright, I am an archaeologist by training, so you'll see through my presentation that I borrow very heavily from the imagery of my discipline, archaeology. And I'm also a very, I'd say, one who is very fond of storytelling. So my presentation may not follow the format of traditional science insofar as numbers and quantifications go, but very much take the, I'd say, the humanities lens to the subject, because I believe that the continent needs to acknowledge the role of the humanities in the development, in the nurturing of science. So as I start, I'll also start from a historical perspective, because I believe oftentimes when we look at the agenda of science on the continent, we tend to forget that there is a rich scientific heritage that we have as a continent. And I believe it's an important context to put in place. The first slide that I will share with you is, sorry, let me just do this, go back a bit, is to highlight where this journey of science and Africa's visioning of science is. And many of you may remember that in 1963, at the occasion of the founding of the OAU, the late President Kwame Nkrumah and one of Africa's intellectuals spoke very cogently about the importance of harnessing science to advance our development as a continent. And at that time, of course, many of Africa's countries were not yet free. The handful who were free also committed to ensuring the total liberation of the continent. The transformation of the OAU to the AU, so among other things, the design and implementation of the strategic direction for science development on the continent, which is ISTISA 2024. And I believe many of us who are familiar with this instrument will know that it has had its, I would say, highlights insofar as helping us to imagine a different world of science, but also it's perhaps, I would say, constraints insofar as the topic of today goes, in that the commitment, especially financial, to realizing the scientific funding on the continent has not been reached. So in terms of my presentation, I have structured it in this way. The first, as I said, is just to reflect on some of the current issues that are topical. Many of us are aware that the last few weeks, especially the last fortnight, have been very, very interesting in terms of, I would say, global science diplomacy or lack thereof. We've seen, among other things, some of the issues that took place in terms of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, where small nations, especially developing nations in the global south, were raising their voice and expressing their concern about the marginalization of the global south. Especially important, of course, was the highlight of the plight of small island nations who were being put under extreme pressure from, of course, the carbon emissions and other such issues that are affecting the global development agenda. And the lack of commitment to financing climate science research and climate change development issues, which had been committed to several years back at the last COP in Paris. Among other things, we've also seen ourselves being caught in the storm of the Omicron virus variant, of the COVID-19 variant, including what has now been termed by many leaders the irrational reaction of the UK, Europe, and other countries in the global north, who immediately took to banning almost all of the Southern African Development Community region countries, simply because scientists in this area, our region in Southern Africa, had done, say, sterling work to highlight the emerging variants and to share this with the world. Among other things, the WHO has also come out to call out what has been termed vaccine inequality and vaccine appetite. And this has also been highlighted by our leaders on the continent at the last UNGA meeting. Now, as I said, I'd like to start from a historical lens, mainly because there is something that almost always seems to get lost in narratives of science on the continent. And that is the idea that Africa has no science history to speak of, which is in fact incorrect, because there's a rich history of science and scientific firsts across the continent. Then thereafter, I'd like to look at the issue of how our regional bodies, the African Union and its earlier iteration, the OAU, had tried to chart the path for science across the continent, especially the agenda to ensure that Africa integrates, Africa develops as a unified continent. I highlight later on some of the challenges, and these are some of the challenges which we in the humanities tend to look at as the bane of the post-colony, in that post-independence, although there were great investments in science research and other developments across the continent, there were also structural barriers, including, among other things, the role of the global north and imperial countries in, one would say, undermining the vision and the impetus of developing science across the continent. We saw the turn, especially in the 1980s, post the structural adjustment programs, that resulted in impacting very negatively development agendas across nation states on the continent, but also created this, I would say, neo-colonial dependency of many countries on their colonial master. However, there's a hope in that technology transformation, especially the Internet of Things, highlighted that even countries which may not have had the most sophisticated technologies at the turn of the century can in fact play catch up. So currently, when we look at the future, we're very hopeful about the possibility of Africa emerging as a continent that can play in a robust way in the fourth industrial revolution. And we're especially delighted as scientists that young Africans, especially very young children who are still in perhaps primary and secondary school, are finding their voices in challenging the global north in respect to climate justice. And these are important developments because our generation would have been the generation that fought for liberation. This new generation is fighting for climate justice and also for science justice, which are things which I believe this platform has provided us with important and interesting lessons over the last year. And I think in conclusion, it's just to come back to the question, why does government matter? And government, in my view, matters insofar as we need to hold each other accountable as global citizens, especially to ensuring that there is justice and equality and respect for human dignity between the rich nations and the developing world. And we see this especially when you look at the nature of relationships that continue to undermine, you could say, the economic independence across the continent, the continued extraction of resources across different countries impacts adversely on the environment in Africa. So if we're to talk about sustainability, we need to be very careful that we hold each other accountable. So in brief, this will be the presentation that I will share with this evening, and I look forward to us engaging in the Q&A later. Now, as I said, I start from the point of view of historical narrative. My profession as an archaeologist has taught me very many lessons about Africa's wealth not only in terms of heritage, but also in terms of the appropriation of knowledge, technology, and science from across the continent. One of the great myths that we tend to be taught when we start school is that Africa does not really have a rich tradition of history. However, and I'm glad that I see many colleagues from Egypt here in the discussion, we are aware that the Egyptian, the Meroitic civilizations, which are more than 5,000 years old, in fact, were African developments. And oftentimes when people speak about Africa as if it's just Africa below the Sahara, there's a tendency to alienate the Africa, which is north of the Sahara, across the Sahel, whereas Africa in its historic development trajectory was in fact a continent that shared very richly from north to south, from east to west. And this is very clearly indicated in the rich heritage across the Sahel, across the Sahara, and across sub-Saharan Africa. And I highlight the importance of this because when you talk about science, oftentimes those who study the discipline called Egyptology tend not to acknowledge its African roots and heritage. And we know that the Nile River and all the developments along it were in fact part and parcel of the scientific heritage of the continent, which was later, of course, transported across the oceans beyond Alexandria into the Greco-Roman world. And therein, from there, we seem to assume scientific know-how started, but in fact, it's the continent of Africa. And also the narrative about who are Africans. We are all Africans. Many of you may be aware of the paleontological work being done by various colleagues on the continent, but I single out especially the Paleontology Origin Center in South Africa at Wits University, where we now have got a very clear understanding of what today is called the Cradle of Humankind, site of origins, which is just outside of Johannesburg in South Africa, and where we've seen a number of world first in terms of discoveries and our ability now to map out the root of humanity. The Out of Africa story is not a myth, it is a reality in terms of the origins of human beings. Modern humans actually originate from this continent. And therefore, when we talk about science and development, this is the lens from which I start. I then also highlight some other developments which have a bearing on how we do history today. When Europe colonized the African continent, especially when you talk about the partition of Africa at the Berlin Conference, there was a very clear agenda of Europe insofar as silencing Africa as a continent so that its people would seem to be lesser than. And these are expressed especially in the racialization of science in the 19th century. Some of you may be familiar with the story of Sarah Baartman and El Negro. These are two human beings who were taken from Southern Africa, displayed in museums in France and in Spain, and dehumanized, and were treated like this because there was an assumption that they could become objects of scientific research, which in fact it was not. I'm glad to say that today we know that they've been reburied. Sarah Baartman is reburied in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. El Negro is buried in Botswana, in the city of Gaborone. And these, of course, are some of the milestones that we celebrate in terms of rehumanizing and re-acknowledging the importance of science in Africa. We also see in terms of actual scientific firsts, some of these issues which often are not talked about. When you look at the subject of mathematics, Africa's rich heritage is indicated when you look at some of these artifacts which were found from different parts of the continent. The Lebombo bone is a very interesting artifact which indicates mathematical computation and calculations which were found at a site in South Africa, just near the Swaziland border. And also we know that there was extremely good engineering insofar as water resource management and agriculture technologies go. The terraces of Nyanga in Zimbabwe, in the northeastern part of Zimbabwe, are today documented as the extensive management of agricultural production and food technologies across the continent of Africa. Also in East Africa, in Kenya, we have similar sites. Across Sudan, we know of similar activities of the management of agricultural technologies to ensure food security. Moving very quickly to what this all means. We know that today, in terms of defining what are priorities in science, the continent has been struggling with pandemics, including natural disasters. One of the realities of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, for example, has been the glaring inequality in terms of access to treatment, which was fought very strongly for in the early 1990s through the 2000s, where treatment for all became a necessary imperative and was not realized there without challenges. It is interesting that even today, the director of UNAIDS, Ms. Winnie Banyima, has highlighted that inequality continues to plague how we distribute resources, and therefore the AIDS pandemic will continue to, with its double challenge with COVID, continue to become a development challenge, not only for the global south, but also for the world at large. Likewise, the Director General of WHO has highlighted that vaccine apartheid has become a very big challenge and a grotesque, you could say, reflection of the inhumanity of the relations between the global north and the global south. And I thought for a bit of humor, I'd highlight one of the more recent cartoons where the banning of travel from the southern part of the continent was in fact based on the assumption that the Omicron variant came from Southern Africa, when in fact it was actually much more globally prevalent. But that has not changed the stance of developed nations. In terms of other areas, we know in terms of social science, say research and activity and activism, that the role of multinationals such as Shell has wreaked extreme damage and vulnerability to not only human lives, but the environment. We know of the plight of the Ogoni people in the Niger Delta of Nigeria. We've heard more recently that Shell is intending to do work along the coast of South Africa, a very fragile ecosystem, the Wild Coast. And the activists took the matter to court, and unfortunately, as we speak, the case has been lost, and they have been granted Shell in this instance the right to continue with their investigations or business trials. Now, the question then is, are African governments silent in this regard? Especially we see in the Niger Delta, when we look at the quantification of the environmental disaster damage, livelihoods have been lost. And as this slide indicates, there's been so many liters of oil spilled into a fragile ecosystem that people cannot do normal day-to-day activities, including fishing. People are eating polluted food crops, including marine resources. People have lost livelihoods insofar as their ecosystem goes. However, the fight back, as indicated in the last COP 2016, is being especially driven by citizen voices. People, especially small islander nations, are coming back to say, no, we do want to live, we do want a healthier earth. And this is actually also being informed by research from science. Not only scientific research across the African continent, but global research is highlighting how some of the activities of richer nations are impacting on the well-being of citizenry, especially the vulnerable small islander nations, as I indicated earlier. Just to go on. So what can be seen as game changers? In this instance, as I said, we as scientists have seen the trajectory of developing good science impacting on policy, what we call the research policy nexus. We know across the African continent that research by scientists who work, for example, in malaria research and other NCD, including non-communicable diseases, as I said, have highlighted the importance of investment in science. We now know that the impact of malaria, especially when it interacts or interfaces with other diseases such as HIV, TB, and others, can be very devastating. Communities are now beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel. We've seen recently the research that has been done in Kenya leading to the innovations around vaccines for malaria. We've also seen the work that has highlighted how the goal towards a 1.5 degrees climate containment is critical if we are to save small island nations. However, we've also seen some of these controversies where other science or other scientists will try to deflect, I would say, there's the evidence to put the blame elsewhere. In this regard, we've seen also some countries, including South Africa, fighting, increasingly raising their voice to ensure that the financing for climate change can be realized. And I think many of us have come to appreciate in more recent times the Prime Minister of Barbados, who over the last few years, in fact, not just this year, but she became much more powerfully heard this year at a delivery at the 76th UN General Assembly and also at COP 2016. She has highlighted extremely passionately the plight of small island nations like Barbados, in that where the world was almost willing to go for a 2 degrees Celsius margin, she highlighted that anything more than 1.5 would have terrible consequences. And I'd appreciate colleagues who have not seen her YouTube presentations to listen to her speeches, because in terms of leadership making a game changer, will realize that this is important. And I highlight her activism as a leader because when we talk about Africa, many of us are aware that the diaspora, especially small island nations across the Caribbean, are in fact critical to the voice of the continent when it comes to global geopolitical discussions and negotiations. So many of us were very pleased to see a leader, and especially a woman leader scientist, stand up and speak about some of these issues which had been in many ways on the agenda, but as has been said even by the Queen, there's a lot of talk and very little action. Now we can begin to see some of these dynamics changing, and we are hopeful that there will be change coming in the near future. In terms of the trajectories of R&D invested in Africa, I think it's important to highlight that, as I said earlier, the colonial state on the continent did not come to develop science and technology on the continent. If anything, it just prepared the continent to become the crucible from which resources could be extracted, whether it was gold across the West African region of the Gold Coast, now Ghana, or diamonds and gold in Southern Africa, or timber elsewhere on the continent. This was the role of the colonial government in terms of resources and people. However, from the independence period, a lot of countries who gained independence, especially late 1950s through the 1960s, had to start almost from scratch, if not from an empty cup, in terms of building the infrastructure that today supports our R&D. This includes education institutions from primary basic education all the way through to public health and communication technologies. It became clear that if these had not been the priorities of the governments who came to power in the 1950s through the 1960s, the continent would be worse off than it is. However, we are also aware that these things tend to be overlooked when people discuss the role of government in modern day Africa, in that people almost always highlight what is seen to be bad government. But there are, I believe, aspects of this narrative that need to be brought to bear. And this is the fact that in the 1980s, or from the 1980s, we saw the deliberate undermining of the post-independence investment in infrastructure by the developed North. In this instance, institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, forced structural adjustment programs across the African continent, which adversely affected the investment in the public sector, especially importantly in education. Those who are familiar with the story of Nigeria, Zambia, Ghana, Ivory Coast, etc., know that the adverse negative impact of structural adjustment on the development of education in these regions, including in countries like Tanzania, which was continuing the financing of the liberation struggle for Southern Africa, were hit hardest. But many of these leaders, including the late Mwalimu Nyerere and President Kenneth Kaunda, remain resolute in defying these institutions to ensure that their populace remain to have access to education. They had access to decent health infrastructure. And importantly, that they continue to finance research that would ensure that their citizenry could be able to do, among other things, projects that enhance agriculture in the area of food security, that enhance the science in the area of access to free and safe public health, especially in the area of maternal health and maternal and child health. Unfortunately, because of the very turbulent period of the 1980s and the 1990s, we entered the decade of the 2000s, a weaker off continent. Many of our governments were faced with extreme vulnerability, especially from conflict, which were internal conflicts and regional conflicts, and also conflicts which were sponsored from beyond our continent. It is clear now, if you are a reader of the politics of the continent, you'll know that many of the instabilities that rocked the continent in the period of the 1980s through the 1990s were in fact fostered or supported by countries in the global north. And even today, when we look at violent conflicts on the continent, many will pose the question: the continent does not manufacture arms and ammunition, and yet the proliferation of ammunition and technologies of war across the continent is way beyond understanding for a continent that does not produce any of those weapons of mass destruction and war. We know, for example, that the war in Angola led to the mining of vast tracts of fertile agricultural land in the southern part of the country, which remains inaccessible to feed the people of Angola today. So when we start to look at the 2000 period, when we now begin to see the global boom in terms of technologies, the new technologies of the IoT, Internet of Things, the mobile telephony, and the new data management technologies. We were a slightly weaker continent, having been hit by the global AIDS pandemic, the environmental disasters such as the famine in East Africa, affecting especially Ethiopia, the war in Somalia. We had weakened and I would say debilitated public institutions. However, my belief is that they continued, even the worst places or spaces, to be commitment. And it is surprising that when one visits countries, for example, if one visits Kenya, when I used to have projects in the Kenyan coast in Mombasa, that despite those hardships, the resilience of ordinary people and of government to supporting research and development activities was really highly laudable. And especially laudable was the commitment of African leaders post-2000 to revitalize the OAU, to found the AU, and to commit to the agenda of development, including founding new policies and interventions and infrastructure framework for peace and security, for technology development, and especially for the global well-being of the continent's citizenry. So we see these as important starting points when we want to look at investment on the continent for R&D. Going further, I highlight that the game changer when you look at some of the countries on the continent, I'll highlight just a few projects. If you look at South Africa, a country I'm more familiar with in terms of the heavy investment in R&D, perhaps I could also highlight later in the discussion examples also from further north in Egypt, where we know that South Africa and Egypt and Nigeria remain some of the, I'd say, leading countries insofar as financing R&D on the continent. In fact, South Africa came closer with Egypt to realizing the 1% financing of science and technology development on the continent, which is the percent of GDP spend that had been committed to. Unfortunately, many countries have not been able to reach even a 0.01% investment in R&D. However, when you look at South Africa, one of the key highlights that I see as critical post-1994 was the advancing of the infrastructure for science and technology, including commitment to regional partnerships. The Department of Science and Technology, which is now the Department of Science and Innovation, fostered very many bilateral and multilateral partnerships across the African continent. We saw South African universities, for example, innovate and initiate global education programs, which, among other things, encouraged the higher education or postgraduate training of young Africans across institutions like University of Cape Town, WITS, UJ, then Rand Afrikaans University, and many others. We also saw the emergence of new projects which rallied across the continent for global partnerships. Many of you may be familiar with the SK Square Kilometer Array project in the Northern Cape, which also shares, among other things, this technological know-how with countries like Botswana and Namibia. And it's important to highlight these because some of you may also have seen if you visit the site of the website of the DSI, you may also have seen that the Science Forum South Africa, which has now become a very global and very interesting platform for showcasing Africa's emerging scientific technologies, know-how, R&D, has gone virtual. It just ended, in fact, this very weekend. And many of the scientists who come to showcase their work, including people from the private sector, civil society, have highlighted the importance of good policies that enable people to interact. Among other things, in South Africa, we've seen councils like the Research Council, like the CSIR, and the Agricultural Research Council, enable partnerships between civil society in such areas such as, for example, agribusinesses, in innovations for technologies that have now advanced new and emerging technologies, not only in addressing the development challenges of, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic with 3D technologies and so forth, but also in ensuring the demystification of science to enable people and young people, especially from previously disadvantaged communities in South Africa, to gain access into world-class institutions and be able to excel as scientists. We've also seen partnerships that have been founded by the African Union through the Auda Nepad. A platform was established at the African Academy of Sciences, which is called the IASA platform, which enabled the cascading of funding from a global consortium of funding partners like Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and other funders to enable scientists in all corners of the continent to go into consortia of research and tackle those very critical developmental challenge issues, including climate science, public health, and also data sciences. We've seen, among other things, at regional level, the work of institutions in the Okawas region when the Ebola pandemic broke out a few years ago. We saw the rapid mobilization of teams from, for example, countries like Senegal, being responsive through the Louis Pasteur Institute to ensure that very critical support was reaching the most affected communities, which in this case were very hard to reach rural communities. What was very interesting in this, especially the Ebola pandemic for me as a social scientist, was the critical lessons that were learned, that not only should the response be informed by biomedical sciences, but must also be very, very targeted to include social sciences, especially the issue of public health communications. Some of the shortfalls that we saw in the HIV/AIDS pandemic was a failure to understand and grasp by, I would say sometimes programs that were designed elsewhere to reach and to impact change in public health epidemics and pandemics. So in this regard, we've seen global partnerships in public health, and PEPFAR is one of those that emerges, which came out of the US through the USAID. We've seen the strengthening of health systems and the encouraging of research, but important to highlight is that this has not happened in a vacuum. There were local institutions and infrastructure that was already there. If you look at East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, there were already health infrastructure that was already existing, health research laboratories that were supported by the global financing to ensure that they were strengthened. So sometimes it is easy for people to assume there was a vacuum and that this external funding just came to create something new. In fact, there were already technologies and systems in place. What we needed to see was a transformation and strengthening of these systems. So in respect to technology and innovation, our universities across the continent, especially if you look at universities in East Africa, and also universities in West Africa, they've been advancing very strongly this idea of inclusive science, especially the inclusion of young people in innovation in the area of fourth industrial revolution. We've seen, for example, young startup technologies that have enabled young people to go into the space of mobile technologies to ensure that they can do, among other things, services that reach the hard to reach people, such as in East Africa and Kenya. The M-Pesa is always highlighted as an innovation that started with young people finding solutions for development using technologies that may be developed elsewhere, but that are now being domesticated. And this is all, of course, thanks to the infrastructure that was there that had been done by our governments in this regard. However, there are always challenges, and one can always say there's not always enough support in terms of financing and the speed at which perhaps policies translate into action. I think one of the other positives post-2010, one can highlight the importance of emerging social media platforms and new technologies, which enabled, I would say, the democratization of science. Social media enabled young scientists, especially, to showcase our work on the social media platforms. Many who are familiar with young scientists and innovators know that most of their technology are first showcased, say, on Facebook. We of the older generation are always using LinkedIn, Twitter as platforms where we can discuss about our own research. So by the time policy issues come to the fore, or we advance our discourses to policy, this would have been fueled and gaining traction at a local level from these platforms. And I think it's critical that we see this as important areas that underscore why government matters. I'll underscore that government matters, and that without our post-independence governments providing the necessary, I'll say, bold and courageous policies that enabled, for one, education to be free and freely accessible in the public domain, to enforce legislation, for example, that enforced all children to go to school, or free education for all, but all learners to be in school, we would perhaps be seeing a continent that is less well off in terms of human capital. But because many governments were very, very, I would say, foresighted or visionary in seeing the future importance of education, many governments ensured that at least basic education was free for all, accessible for all, and also legislated so that parents had to take their children to school. We also saw the very same governments ensure that public health resources were brought forth so that children would get the necessary vaccinations to be able to be in school and to survive the first 5 years of life. We saw that there was safeguarding of resources. For example, many are now looking at the very same critical issue of ethics in the area of research. As I highlighted earlier, 19th century research was anything but unethical, rather ethical. There were a lot of unethical practices, especially those disciplines that may have been taking advantage of the lack of knowledge, the lack of literacy amongst communities. We now see more enforcement of ethics of research to ensure that human beings, especially our rural communities, are not being used as laboratories for science, but actually participate as willing citizens and as partners. This was especially important during the HIV/AIDS pandemic, where especially the health of women was undermined by, I would say, unfair and unprincipled practice of science, which oftentimes looked in a very condescending way at people who were living with HIV, and not bringing them on as partners for generating new knowledge, but the assumption being that the scientists knew all. So we see today the importance of making sure that we have a much more inclusive science practice, much more ethically governed science and research platform and landscapes. More importantly for the continent, I think, is the issue of what resources we bring forth to bear when it comes to financing R&D. One of the most important things we've learned in the last few years, again, thanks to science journalism, has been the impact of the illicit transfer of resources, financial resources from the continent on Africa. Many countries have had, unfortunately, their resources plundered in terms of extracted resources, but also financial resources, which were enabled, unfortunately, by weak government systems to take flight. So a lot of actual money left the continent that should have been on the continent as taxes. Tax havens in the global north undermine financing of R&D on the continent. So it's important that our government become much more robustly visible and active in policing the area of remittance of tax to the national coffers. We've seen, for example, the last few years in South Africa, the whole discussion on state capture, where we've come to understand how, whether by enabling illicit financial flow or being complicit, government civil servants unfortunately resulted with the loss of huge amounts of money out of the South African taxpayers' coffers. This money could have been used to finance services, including education R&D. That said, we've also seen government take a much stronger stance in coordinating partnerships, whether bilateral or multilateral. We've seen, for example, again, outside South Africa, I think I'm much more familiar in terms of government action with South Africa. We've seen South Africa go into the BRICS consortium to ensure that Southern African countries in the SADC region can have a better share of science and technology and alternative financing through the BRICS, as opposed to what has been the traditional global South, global North partnerships. We've seen China emerge as a new player in the global development arena. And many, of course, are a little bit worried about the role of China in Africa. But that said, we've also seen Europe and America continue to exercise their strength across the better part of the continent. So many of our countries, unfortunately, still very dependent on financial support and aid from the developed nations. But that said, in terms of science and science diplomacy, we've seen increasingly much more, I'd say, changed institutional relationships between, for example, the global funding agencies like Wellcome Trust, who are much more amenable to find alternative methods of financing science and strengthening science across the continent of Africa. And this is important because oftentimes where scientists, especially most of us who are scientists working in universities, we tend not to have the clout or the, I would say, the voice, the capacity to engage with funding partners outside. But where we now have stronger institutions which are leveraging this resource and support, then it is much, much more possible to ensure that we can catalyze active and very important scientific work that challenge our development agenda. And I'd like to highlight again from the African Academy of Sciences, the program of AISA, where we saw that young scientists were managing programs to the Global Challenges Africa, which were harnessing technology, harnessing mentorship, harnessing finances from our research partners across the world, especially in the America and in the area of Europe, so that this can be shared and translated into, I would say, actual scientific benefits and solutions for development challenges across the continent. We've seen some of this work, especially bear fruits in the area of malaria research, in the area of agri-sciences, especially livestock production, crop production. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that it is these kinds of innovative new ways of looking at financing science that are critical to ensuring that the region and the continent can have a better understanding of itself and its future and can reimagine its future differently. And I think importantly, government becomes critical when we look at looking at our standing as a continent. I've been reading in the last few weeks a few blogs, especially across LinkedIn, how the narratives about Africa tend to undermine the actual size, geographic size of the continent, and of course the very complex resource-rich nature of the continent. So oftentimes narratives tend to posit the continent as a poor resourced, a poor governed continent, whereas our capital is in fact multiple and diverse. And in this regard, coming together to create that stronger voice can help us begin to purposefully and deliberately reach global milestones. For example, right now we know that the HIV/AIDS pandemic undermined our reaching the MDGs. Now COVID-19 is undermining our capacity to reach the targets of the SDGs. But however, despite that, by our governments committing to ensuring that they have the necessary infrastructure to begin to do some of this quantitative work, to target the milestones, to do good monitoring and evaluation of where we are in terms of reaching these milestones, we are better informed in terms of action. And I think it's critical that now we see government and institutions harnessing technologies for using e-government as a tool to ensure that we have much more data science informed ways of governance, which is actually impacting very well on policy. So from my point of view, government matters in R&D. And it is not always easy to say that we are getting the best in terms of financial input, in terms of whether you look at universities or in terms of technologies that are being developed for services. We know that we've been seeing a greater reduction of financing of higher education across the continent, but we've also seen the rise and the emergence of private universities. So the private sector has become a better partner and actor. And it's also critical so that this can also begin to unlock resources for financing R&D. We've seen the engagement and interest of Africa's philanthropists, the percentage of well-off persons. If I were to highlight people such as Strive Masiyiwa, have begun to invest very heavily in education R&D. And this, of course, complements what government is also bringing to the table. Going towards my conclusion, I'd highlight in terms of the future, what perhaps are the imperatives that I see. I believe that as you've seen in the calls to action by the WHO director, and I'm glad that he's an African brother who can also look at and see images of ourselves in, and likewise the director of UNAIDS, that African leadership must assert its voice and call out injustice, whether it's injustice in the area of public health, as in the HIV pandemic or the COVID-19 pandemic, or injustice insofar as the transfer of technology and know-how to scientists on the continent goes. We must ensure that we use our continental voice to renegotiate these partnerships with the global north. The issue of patents, I think, is critical to highlight. And it's very pleasing to see that young scientists across the continent, if I take the example of the Louis Pasteur Institute in Senegal again, they have been working tirelessly to look at exploring vaccine development on the continent. And it's a pleasure that even today as we speak, South Africa has actually begun that process of ensuring that COVID-19 vaccines can be produced on the continent and be distributed on the continent. And this will take away some of the anxieties that we saw happening in the last half of the year from June, when the high rise of COVID infections across the continent was accompanied by a high death rate, mainly because people were not vaccinated. We need to address the issue of reparations, and reparations here I can highlight a very peculiar and important area of discourse that has happened in the social and human sciences for the last few decades. We know that, for example, the global slave trade was an injustice against and a crime against humanity. We know that apartheid was a crime against humanity. But in respect to ensuring restorative justice, there's often less inclination to talk about reparations, but I'm glad to see that in the case of Namibia, the German government has accepted wrongdoing and has accepted to pay in financial terms, and there can never be perhaps a quantification of loss of human lives through atrocities done in the past. But the fact that a government acknowledges it's wrong and can agree to remit finances to ensure that it goes towards development work in the affected countries, I think it's important to acknowledge as a game changer. Similarly, the Paris agreements on climate change financing, which have just been underscored and reiterated in terms of pledges at Glasgow, need to be pursued so that we do not again reconvene in another 5 or so years and find that that money has not been remitted. We need to ensure that we reaffirm the commitment of the African Union and all nation states of the African continent to financing R&D. The target is 1%, but we need to go beyond that 1%, because those of us who have worked in research councils and universities know that you need more than a 1% budget for you to do decent science that has long-term and sustainable results. The R&D that we've seen being done by global North institutions, including laboratories of the big pharma like Pfizer, did not happen overnight. In fact, it came from decades of investment. So we must also take the long-term perspective of going beyond the target of 1% to ensure that we can finance climate, not just climate, but R&D across the continent. I'm passionate now about climate change because that has been really the topic on discussion in the last few weeks. We also need to see more solidarity in promoting innovation in the continent. I come from a diamond-rich country. I think many of you are aware that the last few months, Botswana has seen the recovery of some of the biggest diamonds ever seen in human history. I'm glad that has happened in the post-independence states so that they can actually accrue wealth to the country. But there is also a very important issue to be discussed in respect to mineral wealth, especially when one looks at a country like DR Congo, one of the wealthiest countries insofar as diversity of mineral resources goes. But because of ongoing conflict, the citizenry cannot realize the benefits of this wealth. And the question is, why is this happening? And again, I'll go back to the Shell story, in that the global multinationals who actually benefit a lot from these resources oftentimes do not have in place programs to benefit communities. And by benefit, we don't mean donating T-shirts and small textbooks to students. We're talking about translating that wealth into actual science R&D spend for the continent, for developing innovation. I was very pleased to see that we begin to see some institutions that begin to see themselves as different types of investors insofar as partnership with communities go. And this is where you see mineral extraction companies beginning to target development and financing to the communities where they work. We've seen this in Botswana with some companies beginning to directly finance girls in STEM, directly finance young innovators in the area of arts and crafts and the cultural industries, in diamond work, diamond polishing, and in gem making. We need to ensure that we can reinforce that democracy must always be the undercurrent that underscores science and technology research on the continent. Unfortunately, we've seen across the continent, especially at the time of the elections, where governments react in a negative way to the use of technology. This includes, among other things, the shutting down of social media, the banning of scientists, and sometimes the imprisonment of scientists. Across the continent, we've seen scientists being targeted at the first port of call when there's a conflict emerging. It is unfortunate that oftentimes, as a global world of science, we don't speak out enough about the vulnerability of scientists, especially those who are doing the kinds of work that is often seen as classified or sensitive. But it's important that we underscore that all research is for the value of humanity and therefore must be done in a free and fair and safe environment. And I believe we need to promote a culture of inclusive science. As a woman scientist, oftentimes, especially in my field, archaeology, we had to spend extended periods of time in very isolated environments doing field research. It was not always possible to guarantee the safety of one's camp or one's mentee students and so forth and so on. It's especially become more difficult to carry out research across the continent in various sciences, like, for example, even paleontology, because most of these sites are in remote areas. And many people, including in range ecology, have become vulnerable. We know that in South Africa, especially, poachers are much more sophisticated and equipped when it comes to having weaponry than our rangers. So it's important that we also provide a better understanding of the ecosystem of R&D so that we don't create these silo of science and technology as separate from other areas of research, including the human and social sciences. And that, in my view, is that where government needs to bring together all the areas of government, the public sector, the private sector, civil society, to ensure that we can really unleash this good science practice and culture across the African continent. And I'd like to leave a few resources for you. I believe later on, when the presentation is uploaded, you'll see some of the sources that I've used in terms of looking at some of the key topical issues. And I'd like to just say thank you very much for your audience. And I believe we can go into a much more robust discussion with your questions and comments. Thank you, Bright. Over to you.
Prof, thanks very much. I think this is extremely fantastic. This is comprehensive, really, and I'm not sure where we start from, because you have raised a number of issues. You started by reminding us of our rich historical antecedents as a continent, which is contrary to what we have been told in many forums. So this recollection, I think, is very good for every one of us, so that our self-esteem in the world can be raised, because when you go through the global platforms, Africa is always seen as the baby. But what you have highlighted here is that we have been once the leaders. And if I summarize your presentation in few sentences, your call this evening is that Africa needs to retake its position that it once had. But that is a big question now. How does that happen? So I wouldn't go too much to really, I think this was very clear for everyone. One thing that touched me was also when you emphasized the fact that we are all Africans. We are all Africans. So regardless of where you find yourself, I didn't hear so much really how as Africans, perhaps you can bring that forward in let's say future session, how Africans can grow in love, recognizing this perspective you have shared. We are all Africans, because you hear different injustices done against fellow Africans in the continent. Your conclusion was apt, and there are several questions that have been raised here, many questions coming up. Some of those you have touched them in your conclusion, but I'm still going to present them so that perhaps this conversation can also continue to the satisfaction of everyone who is asking these questions. All right, I will share my screen and I will read the questions out to you. Okay, this is the first question. According to Prof, your experience, what do you think are the challenges with regards to creation of scientific hubs to look at different interventions using IKS? I'm not sure what that is. Perhaps you know. And what do you think can be your advice in this problem?
Okay, thank you very much. IKS, for those who are not familiar with the concept, means indigenous knowledge. IKS became I would say, a familiar term for many of us in the human and social sciences, where we're looking at traditional knowledge held in communities, especially communities which have been marginalized from the colonial period and beyond. Because as you may know, a lot of Africa's technology and know-how was destroyed actually during the colonial period. I was going to highlight that, in fact, what we've seen in more recent times is countries like France and Germany begin to repatriate heritage remains, which were taken from, for example, countries like Egypt, countries like Nigeria, Benin. These are being brought back. But oftentimes these were destroyed because they were seen as pagan. But these were the actual products of scientific know-how. So we tend to use the word indigenous knowledge system to find a way to generate discourse about science that is known and held in communities, including, for example, indigenous medicine. Oftentimes, for example, now in the treatment of malaria, we don't highlight the importance of indigenous ways of treating malaria in malaria research, whereas it exists. So what the colleague is asking about scientific hubs, in fact, this is actually the project that is being done by the African Union. You may be aware that they are creating centers of excellence across the continent. And so CISA 2024 is looking at how we can create these hubs across the continent. I would say one of the things that I, as a person, have observed is that oftentimes African countries and states, unfortunately, are too bound to their colonial borders and boundaries. So we not foster strong inter-regional and inter-country partnerships. For example, most African universities prefer to have partnerships with the global north or with the USA at the expense of having partnerships from within the continent. So I think one of the things that needs to actually begin to happen is to ensure that these partnerships can happen between universities in the regions and across the continent. I can highlight, for example, the University of Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal, which has many students who come from outside of Senegal. And that's because the country itself has fostered since its independence this welcoming approach to non-Senegalese. But on the other hand, other countries on the continent become very inward looking and oftentimes do not promote the inclusion of citizens from other countries. We've seen, for example, recently South Africa, which had a very progressive policy of enabling Zimbabweans who are going through very difficult times in terms of economy to work in South Africa, revoke that project. And this, of course, will have the devastating impact of creating a lot of, I would say, unfortunate fallout in terms of the partnerships that were done by individuals in institutions and independent think tanks and across other platforms in civic society. So I think scientific hubs are critical and should be actually driven through the agenda of the AU and regional hubs. In the SADC region, which is the Southern African Development Community, the secretariat is based in Gaborone. We should be seeing a lot more research that is coming through and driven through the regional hubs and the secretariats of the regional consortium. But underscoring all that is that these centers of excellence are already in the process of being formed through the African Union's agenda of STISA. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Prof, for that exhaustive answer. And some of the things you mentioned to promote integration of Africans. And that is one of the things we try to achieve within the African Science Frontiers Initiative platform, where Africans from every walks of life and the countries come together. And it's amazing what we have been able to achieve during the last year for African scientists to come together, propose research questions, and are working together in that. I think that is one way of integration. The COVID has made it that we can use IT to connect, and these people have not met themselves in real life before, but fantastically growing in a way that we all can appreciate that Africans can team up and make something good from themselves. So integration is quite important. All right, the second question, why is Africa the continent of international aid? Yes, there is help in other countries outside of Africa, but Africa is extensively a continent of aid, humanitarian, scientific, etc. Poverty, corrupt government, men, etc. How can we create an African scientific movement capable of improving the political leadership of our countries?
Thank you very much for that question. To answer it briefly, I'll say, as I said earlier, there are narratives about the continent that we as people need to critique and be consciously critiquing to see where narratives are being made which are falsified or factual. I think in respect to the issue of bad governance, this cuts across the world. We know, for example, that, as I said earlier, illicit financial flows did not just get up and leave the continent. They were given haven by countries in the global north. Tax havens in, for example, the United Kingdom, the island of Jersey, Switzerland, and many other countries are where wealth looted from the continent was stored. And this wealth can still be repatriated, but those countries have chosen not to return the money to the rightful owners on the continent. And so therefore, it's a two-way traffic in terms of who corrupts who and who can be seen to be corrupt. Aid is a very interesting and complex issue, and there are people who have done work in this area besides us in the human and social sciences. The very interesting thesis that have been developed around what is aid. But on the contrary, as I've said, the African continent is rich in terms of mineralogical and other resources. There's no shea butter tree in the Western world, if I'm not mistaken. Shea butter comes from West Africa, from countries like Ghana. It's exported in raw form. If we were able to begin to ensure that processing of resources that are found in the continent is done on the continent, we would not be needing to reach out with a begging bowl as a people. Unfortunately, many countries are caught in bilateral and multilateral agreements with countries in the north that ensure that indebtedness continues to be a challenge. So unfortunately, as happens even in rich countries like Namibia, where I'm sitting today, or Botswana, which have diamonds, replete, they still have to go and ask and borrow money. At one point, Botswana had very huge wealth reserves in terms of money. But unfortunately, these are undermined by the kinds of agreements that the countries are forced to go into, maybe because they are working in terms of complexity of the institutions, which much more sophisticated institutions. But it's important that when we talk about corruption, we look at it as not just an African problem, but as a global problem. And if we look at how we can stop aid, is how we've seen the new financing mechanisms, new partnerships, for example, that actually promote venture capital and you could say principal financing, as opposed to going to borrow by the continent. The continent is well resourced enough to generate its own wealth. Unfortunately, it's the management of those mechanisms that remains a problem. And that's where the future young Africans, in terms of training, we need to be unlocking their know-how and skills in those areas that our older leaders did not perhaps have. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much. All right, question number 3. How can we guide How can we guide research as scholars in appropriate technologies for Africa to deal with African problems without depending on the Western countries for help, which is never enough? I think this is also close to what you have just answered now.
Yes, I was going to say that, in fact, that's the kind of question that was embedded in the second question. But I, again, answer to say, if I look at, as I've said earlier, the kind of R&D that is being done within the continent, if I look at malaria research in East Africa, if I look at Ebola research and now COVID research in Senegal and West Africa at large, if I look at animal livestock research that's been done by vet scientists on the continent, in fact, we are seeing that we do have the capacity and the human capital to actually deal with these problems without needing to go outside to go and borrow. Unfortunately, as I said, R&D financing takes a long-term view. And unfortunately, much of the sophisticated technologies, especially for laboratories and for scientists who work in bioscientific scientific areas, they do need that cooperation and collaboration to ensure that they have access to the best labs equipment to do the kind of work that will then generate the kind of findings that address the problems we see. And in a different world, we should be seeing these partnerships actually being fostered between institutions across the continent and across the world. But unfortunately, as we've seen with the COVID vaccine, where African scientists, in fact, even with COVID-19, quite a number of scientists who were working on the COVID vaccines were scientists from Africa and the diaspora. But this is not often acknowledged by our governments. And the question then comes, why are they sitting in institutions in the global north? And this comes to a different question that may be discussed at a different panel, that what has been called the brain drain by the continent is something that needs us to revisit. Why are the best scientists on the continent sitting elsewhere other than in the continent? And that in part explains why we're not seeing the rapid uptake of science and technology, innovation and research that solves our problems on the continent. So we continue to be dependent on the global north, unfortunately.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks, Prof. Sad reality. Okay, given that you indicated that most African countries spend less than 1% of their GDP for research, what, in your opinion and experiences, are the major obstacles for African government in investing larger percentage of their GDP into research, given the well-known importance of science for national and continental development?
To be very frank, as a historian, as a student of the humanities, the question lies in my first 6 slides, in that many governments at independence inherited a plundered state. Most of our countries were coming to the table with a deficit. If I look at Botswana, in 1966, when the first government took power, or even Zambia, when President Kaunda came to power, they inherited an empty barrel. In fact, in West Africa, we know that some of the countries which were ruled by France, when the French left, they in fact destroyed the infrastructure to make sure that the new governments had nothing. So oftentimes when we judge our countries which are less than 60 years old at independence in the main, Namibia was just 30 years old, South Africa were less than 30 years old. These countries are addressing wrongs that had been done in the past. And if I put it to myself, even if I had money and could buy good things where I start working, if I'm starting from a deficit, I'm going to spend more making up and patching that deep hole. So our countries, our governments, unfortunately, have the same dilemma. They are trying to address wrongs that were done, injustices that were done in the past. And that is why I said the issue of reparations and restorative justice needs to come into discussions about how do we ensure the global north actually pays for wrongs that have been done. If you look at apartheid in South Africa, it ensured many people did not go to school. Many Black people could not get education or housing or services. The modern day government has to try to provide for all of those people. In Namibia, the issue of land, many people were dispossessed of land. So how do we ensure that whatever is in the public fiscus today from taxes can be spread and ensure that everybody benefits? That is a challenge. This cannot be done without the global north coming to the party. That is why I'm saying when you look at the future, climate justice and climate financing should hold accountable the global north to ensure that financial resources are actually brought to ensure that the damage done in the colonial government can be restored to ensure restorative justice and ensure that our modern day governments, despite what we see as corruption and mismanagement of resources, actually delivers on the development agenda of the continent. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. I have a hand, Chibeze Bonna. I just ask, you can unmute yourself and ask your question before we continue to show the ones on the screen. Chibeze, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Waru and Prof for the presentation. I just wanted to find out.
Chibeze, your line is too bad. We can't hear you. Perhaps you can write it. You can write it on the. You can write it on the chat box.
And Africa. For me, we need to scientifically deal with how they were also colonized. Sorry, you can't hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we didn't hear you. We didn't hear you
until
now. If you can put it on the chat, yeah. All right. So I will continue to show. All right. This is another question. I think it's also close to what Prof has just addressed. Given the current research landscape in Africa vis-a-vis Africa's development, what type of future developmental outlook does Africa have, considering its huge challenges and increasing population? Prof?
Thank you. I believe one of the untapped wealth of the continent is its human capital. We as a continent actually have a very youthful population. The bulk of our citizenry are under the age of 35. This in comparison, say, with Asia, where they have aging populations. We should be seeing this as a strength rather than a weakness, because young people still have their life ahead of them. They are able to become productive citizens. Unfortunately, because of the current, I would say, global climate, where we have been in a very negative growth situation since the last global meltdown, many young Africans are not getting the kind of education and, you could say, stimulus to ensure that they optimize their skills in terms of education, innovation. But that notwithstanding, as I said earlier, if you go to a country like Kenya, you go to Nairobi and find young people industriously exercising and playing in the area of new technology, service provision, you will find that despite the constraints they face, they actually realize a lot. During the COVID pandemic, many young people were the ones, for example, in Ethiopia, who were able to innovate in these technologies for ensuring the, for example, release of sanitizers. They were able to innovate in producing sanitizers and ventilators without any assistance. You see every single day across LinkedIn, young people looking for financing. So I think what needs to be happening is we need to be seeing, especially the world of service, I mean, the sector of service, financial services, beginning to take a much more keen interest in financing young people in the informal sector to support startups, to support innovations, to ensure that they can reach to commercialization level. This can also be done in partnership with universities and other higher education institutions, because many young people, for example, in rural areas, don't have access to resources, but they do have access, for example, to telephone technology. And with that, they are able to do a lot. So I think it's a question of how we manage the collaborations and partnerships in a coordinated way to ensure smart financing can take place to help young people to flourish. In Namibia, for example, if you go by the roadside in Windhoek, where I am based, you'll find young people doing arts, crafts, in woodwork and so forth. These can actually be scaled up to cottage industries that produce world-class furniture and get export to markets. But unfortunately, the issue of the coordination of the ecosystem from the individual informal sector producer to the global market, there's all that problems that come into play. But luckily, the African Free Trade agreements are there, the implementation is started. So there's greater understanding of the importance of connecting the markets within Africa. And that for me is the one big positive that has happened in this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks, Prof. Okay, here is another one. Thank you, Prof. But how has the Asians dealt with the impact of colonization vis-a-vis development, especially ROFD?
I think two countries to look at and to take great interest in as the African continent are China and India. Both China and India were colonized. Both China and India were able to look at development from within and to transform their economies, especially by looking at ways to address the issue of poverty. The biggest ways in which they did that was to expand their manufacturing sectors and then to go into the services industry. But both countries were able to ensure that they actually become smarter in terms of deploying their human capital, in that both countries were able to ensure their young people were trained, often with government support, beyond their borders. In other countries, for example, many young Chinese, many young Asians, Indians, and other Asian countries send their young people to train in America. They were able to gain and harness that technological know-how. They return back to their countries and are able to bring that technology and know-how into their own economies. The continent of Africa at the moment, we do also have that, in that many young people in the diaspora actually are beginning to take great interest in returning back to their countries. If you look at Ethiopia again, many young Ethiopians have come back to Ethiopia and contributing to the revitalization of the economy. I think that's some of the ways in which we can begin to see win-win situations being done. Unfortunately, we do as a continent have a slight challenge, because we are a diverse continent, in that many countries pursue bilateral partnerships with countries like India and China, again, at the expense of having collective bargaining voice as a continent, which we should ideally be doing. So we rush to bilateral agreements which undermine internal, inter-country, intra-country, intra-regional partnerships that could actually unlock wealth between the citizenry of the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. Okay, the eighth question. In many countries in the global north, the private sector is the main driver of research funding. Where is Africa in this? And if not optimal, what is the Africa's government doing in terms of policy incentives that allow the private sector to take leadership in science and scientific research?
Again, I'll answer this question from a social scientist's point of view. Like I said earlier, global multinationals which are on the African continent are not independent entities, but remain just that, global multinationals. So when they talk about, say, for example, Shell or British Petroleum, these are multinationals which have their roots and base in the global north, including in the financial sector. The Barclays Bank, Standard Banks of this world are not institutions, private sector institutions that are African. So it is no wonder that they don't always remit. In fact, they take out more than they remit back to their countries. But we've seen the emergence of young African-led, African-owned industries. We've seen, for example, Dangote in Nigeria becoming a big funder as a sponsor of higher education. We've seen Strive Masiyiwa, as I said earlier, become a big funder in the sector of higher education. We've seen Mo Ibrahim emerge as a funder of good governance leadership across the continent. We've seen increasingly younger players, new service sectors. For example, I'll highlight the two partners who said Access Bank. Access Bank is increasingly becoming a big partner and player across the continent. They're actually demystifying the world of banking. And these are, for me, exciting developments that show that young Africans, when they say, yes, we can, they actually, and are given the opportunity to partner with governments, they're actually much more able and willing to come to the party for African governments to partner with. Unfortunately, there is also the continued undermining of such efforts by the global north, because let's face it, capitalism is a winner-takes-it-all system. So we should not be expecting any mercy or kindness out of the global multinationals when it comes to competition that comes from within. But we should be seeing our governments actually put in place those preferential support systems for internal development of enterprises, entrepreneurship. We've seen, for example, countries try that, but oftentimes there's a backlash from the global north. In the agribusiness, America, when some of the countries like South Africa tried to protect their own producers, the backlash was very, very heavy and very quick. So we need to be actually vigilant, not only to look at the political space or the financial space or the higher education space, but to look at the entire ecosystem of development and say, who are the actors, who are the players, who are the saboteurs, where do we see opportunities for the future, and how do we become active citizens to also begin to call out these global players in what they are doing. We've seen that begin to happen, for example, in West Africa. There's increasing call for France to decolonize the French franc, the CFA rather, which is the currency of the former colonies of the French West Africa region. So we begin to see citizenry beginning to call for action and call for accountability, call for justice to ensure that development can be driven from within. And that's commendable.
Thank you, Prof. We're almost getting there. See many questions. You arouse a lot of interest. So we'll see this through. How can African leaders be compelled to increase yearly budgetary allocation for education sector in line with the UNESCO education budget recommendation?
Thank you for that question. In fact, my sense is that African governments, if I look again, for example, countries that I'm familiar with, Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa, they do put money a lot into the education sector. Unfortunately, what is missing is perhaps the distribution of where to put priorities. We know for a fact, for example, that TVET should be more funded as an emerging area in education, but it continues to be underfunded. We know that higher education institutions, universities should be getting a bit more financing, but it's not happening at the moment. If anything, there's a decline in financing of higher education institutions like universities. I think what needs to be asked as a question is, where should we be taking that money from? I think our governments must be held accountable in that a lot of our national budgets are going to the wrong spaces. A lot of funding is going, for example, to the armies to protect conflicts that we not generate, but are obviously lucrative for those who have an interest in stake in those conflicts. So I think in terms of budgeting and finance allocation, we need more civic action in ensuring that we take our governments to task when doing the budgets to see where financing is going. And it's very good that a number of countries actually have, like Kenya, have civic participation in the budget making process so that there is accountability in where the financing can go. Once more countries begin to do that, we would see perhaps a better resource distribution. And I think here one can highlight two of our other mental institutions. The African peer review mechanism in the African Parliament should be spaces where African civic society should be calling to task governments, certain governments, to ensure that these very actions of public civic education in budget reforms and budget sharing is being done, so that citizenry are much more able to be informed where and how finances are being used when it comes to allocation to education. But sadly, I'd say the continent has had to divert a lot more funding to public health, especially to fight malaria, TB, HIV/AIDS, and now COVID. So unfortunately, education will continue to, in the immediate short-term future, get less and less financing. That should be the case.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. All right. Prof, what is your thoughts in regard to availability of qualified scientists who can engage in effective research in Africa?
As a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences, I'm very aware that we have the wealth on the continent in terms of scientists. I've had the opportunity as a fellow of the AAS to review a number of funding proposals that were coming through our programs of AISA program under the various funding projects like the Deltas program. These are open calls that are made. Africa is rich in terms of scientific know-how, and I'd say scholarship in general, intellectual scholarship. Unfortunately, as I've said, many don't get the R&D they need at their home institutions, and therefore it's important that we actually begin smart, and I'm glad that ASFI has been doing this in terms of training researchers to be able to apply for the funding that is in the global arena to ensure that they can finance their research on the continent. Many young people, especially emerging researchers, don't have the capacity to apply for funding, whether from the philanthropic institutions or just any other area. So those are the key core skills when we train young scientists. We need to ensure they can not only apply for funding, but also manage the funding so that they can remain accountable and fundable. Because oftentimes some get the funding, but don't know how to manage it and end up being blacklisted from receiving future funding. So it's important that we can train our young researchers to do science properly. In terms of effectiveness, most of our scientists do research which is effective. For example, as I said, in terms of take livestock management, many of our scientists have done amazing work in terms of agri-engineering to ensure that, for example, our African species are much more hardy in respect of our environment. We know that many of our scientists have helped the continent fight back against the global north in terms of GMO to protect indigenous species of the continent. And those are things oftentimes that are not being talked about. But we need to highlight some of this work because most of these scientists remain unknown, underpublished, because they generally don't have that extra support in terms of science communication capabilities. But I'm glad that ASFI is doing some of this work, and we'll see that more scientists get to be known across the continent.
Thank you, Prof. That is fantastic to bring ASFI this discussion. We started just over a year ago, and we have had good testimonies from some of our trainees who have secured very good international funding after going through our training. So we try to play our role. Training and capacity building is very important, but I agree with Prof. Africa is rich with fantastic scientists, both home and abroad. For the young ones that are coming, you have platforms like this to help you to increase your capacity and become more competitive in what you do. All right, so this is the final question. We'll end it here. I'm interested in the presenter's take on the matter of still continuing disparities, historical inequalities within the university sector in South Africa, and whether the government's role might not be complicit in perpetuating such disparities in general and in science promotion and monitoring in particular. What could be the practical alternatives in addressing such science agency disparities?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's a very tough one. Transformation in the academy is a very difficult one. For some of us who are mid-career or almost late career, we've seen some of these challenges in terms of the nature of the academy, the structure, the hierarchy, the bureaucracy. And let me be very honest, the human factor that keeps people down. In my country, we always say that a PhD sometimes is a what do you call it, a phrase that say pull her down, because or pull him down, because oftentimes there's lack of I'd say cooperation, collaboration. There's more competition, which is more violent than it is collaborative in academic institutions. Oftentimes my young mentees always say they didn't know when they signed up in the academy that it's going to be so tough. South Africa is particularly peculiar, as to Namibia in that regard, in that the historic academy had been obviously meant to privilege a particular group, in this case, a racialized privilege. The transformation process has been started. We know that in the last few years, young people especially have been calling very strongly for the decolonization of the academy. We've seen government in South Africa take leadership in ensuring that the leadership of the institutions, especially at the higher level, is at least seen to be transformed. We've seen, for example, young Black VCs come in. If I can highlight Professor Marwala at UJ, Professor Parking at UCT, Professor Puleng Lenkabula at UNISA, and Professor Vilakazi at WITS, and a few others across the institution. These historically white institutions have now become much more transformed. However, transformation is a very complex thing, in that you can transform the top leadership, but the curriculum within remains very problematic. The actual teaching and knowledge remains diplomatic. I remember when we were young undergraduates studying in the 80s, there were lecturers who were famous for telling young learners in the sciences that you're too dumb to understand mathematics. You can never understand physics or chemistry. And we internalize those kinds of things. And it is painful that young people still face those things in the class. And the question is, where and how do institutions provide for, I would say, calling out those kinds of bullies in the academy? I'm glad that institutions have become more innovative. For example, UCT has a whistleblowing safe line that ensures that young people can call out those persons who are doing that. A number of other institutions are doing that. But I think the biggest challenge across the institutions that we see in higher education is unfortunately a much more underspoken of pandemic, and that is that pandemic of violence, gender-based violence. And that is something that in my talk I'd wanted to talk a little bit more about, but unfortunately for lack of time, one couldn't go in there. I think the issue of the higher education institutions being sites of gender-based violence is something that even in this kind of platform we'll need to talk about. But the transformation has to happen. It's not happening fast enough, unfortunately, in terms of leadership and ensuring that these institutions are representative, because historically, again, wealth was with those families who have resources. But we've seen innovative mechanisms like UCSASA financing that is funding the what we call the missing middle in South Africa, targeting those young disadvantaged learners who would not ordinarily qualify for government bursaries. If more countries could begin to find innovative ways of financing what we call the missing middle, or those young people who fall through the gaps in terms of being eligible for government financing, we could see some of these inequalities and historical inequities being redressed a little bit faster, but it will take time, unfortunately.
Thank you, Prof. We highly appreciate this. You can see evidence by the number of questions. I think this is one of those we have had which amount of important questions. The truth is that some things are still unresolved. So please don't be surprised if we call you back here again next year, because these are some of the challenges we should have for the younger generation, putting us in our historical perspective, our present condition, and giving us a highlight of where we should be going. So thank you, and we very much appreciate this. Just to say for the participants, we evaluate each session whenever we have it. So Eman has sent the link to you. Please help us to evaluate this session, because that will help us to improve in upcoming sessions. Just to finish up before we let you go, our last edition of this seminar series for this year is coming up on the 19th of December, and that will be focusing on the role of NGOs and charities in promoting scientific research in Africa. And we'll be having Professor Balile Dwai, who will be speaking to us on that topic. In addition to that, we'll be having the last edition of our My Career, My Story. Please don't miss this. This is going to be a very good end of year gift to every one of us in ushering us into the new year 2022, where we engage in other perspectives. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Eman, do you want to take a picture before we leave?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So usually, as Eman does, please just put on your camera, and Eman will take your picture. Give her a big smile.
Hello.